If you grew up in the 1980s, this sound was almost a signal that a legend was about to begin. Top Gun, the movie that turned a young pilot named Maverick into an icon for an entire generation. But behind that legend are stories even crazier than what you saw on screen. One actor tried to sabotage his own audition and still got cast. Another person nearly lost his life during filming. And at one point, an entire country even used footage from Top Gun to claim it was their own Air Force. If you think you already know every secret about this movie, just wait. Here are the 20 most shocking secrets behind Top Gun from 1986. Buckle up before this nostalgia ride blows your mind. Number 20. The real-life inspiration for Top Gun actually hates the movie. If you grew up in the 1980s, you probably remember what it felt like the first time you watched Top Gun. The roar of the F-14 engines across the big screen. Tom Cruise walking under the sun in aviator sunglasses, and suddenly the name Top Gun became something the whole world recognized. The movie quickly became a box office phenomenon and turned a real US Navy training program into part of pop culture. I still remember that time. Aviator sunglasses and leather flight jackets were everywhere, like half the country suddenly wanted to become fighter pilots. The interesting part is that the story did not start in Hollywood. It started with a 1983 article in California magazine titled Top Guns, which followed elite pilots training at the Navy's Top Gun school. Producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer read that article and immediately realized it could become a major movie. So for a long time, I assumed the real school must have been grateful that the film made them famous worldwide. But the reality is a little different. According to former Top Gun pilot and instructor Guy Buss Snodgrass, quoted by HistoryNet students, at the real school can actually be fined $5 if they quote lines from the 1986 movie. The real Top Gun is about strict discipline, not Hollywood catchphrases. And the story of this film gets even stranger than that. At one point, an aerial combat scene from Top Gun even appeared on television in another country, presented as if it were their own military victory. Can you guess which country that was? Number 19. Chinese television once used an explosion scene from Top Gun as their own military footage. Sometimes I like to joke that Top Gun feels like a favorite child of both Hollywood and the United States itself. And when a cultural icon becomes that big, there is always a strange moment when it seems like every country wants a version of it. A very odd story happened in January 2011. China's state television network, CCTV, aired a report about an Air Force training exercise. In the broadcast, a jet was shown exploding in mid-air, presented as a target that had just been shot down by a Chinese J-10 fighter. But some viewers quickly noticed something very familiar. After comparing the footage frame by frame, internet users realized the explosion looked almost identical to the scene where an F-5 is shot down during the final dogfight in Top Gun. The fireball, the smoke, even the flying debris matched almost perfectly. Once the story began spreading online, the segment quickly disappeared from the broadcast. And that tells you something important. The influence of Top Gun clearly goes far beyond an ordinary action movie. But the story people repeat most often about the film actually revolves around a single number. And that brings us to the next fact. Number 18. Top Gun increased US Navy recruitment by 500%. For years, there has been one story that almost always appears whenever people talk about Top Gun. You have probably heard it too. The claim is that after the film was released in 1986, recruitment for the US Navy increased by 500%. It is a huge number, and honestly, for a long time I thought it sounded believable. But when journalists began checking the claim, the story became a little less dramatic. A fact check by AAP traced the number back to a book published in 2004 that offered no clear source. Actual U.S. Navy data shows that the total number of recruits in 1986 increased by only about 8%. And if you think the movie's appeal was always tied to the character Maverick, you may be surprised to learn that Maverick was originally almost played by someone completely different. Number 17. John Travolta was the first choice for Maverick. It is hard to imagine Top Gun without Tom Cruise. In the memory of many viewers, Cruise and that character are almost the same person. But that was not always the plan. In the early days of the project, the actor the producers wanted for Maverick was not Tom Cruise. It was John Travolta, the star of Saturday Night Fever. The first time I heard that story, I honestly had to pause for a moment and try to picture what Top Gun with Travolta might have looked like. But after several rounds of negotiation, the plan fell apart. His salary demands were high, and a few of Travolta's recent films had not performed well at the box office, which made the studio nervous about the risk. Tom Cruise was not immediately eager either. At first, he actually turned the role down. Everything changed when the Navy took Cruise on a demonstration flight. According to producer Jerry Bruckheimer, after experiencing the G-forces and aerial maneuvers, Cruise stepped off the runway, ran straight to a nearby payphone, and called the producers to say he was in. And the rest is history. But the funny thing is that even after accepting the role of Maverick, there was one thing in the movie Tom Cruise had never done before. Number 16. Tom Cruise had never ridden a motorcycle before filming Top Gun. There is a detail in Top Gun that still makes me laugh whenever I think about it. In the movie, Tom Cruise looks completely confident riding a motorcycle down the runway while an F-14 roars behind him. The scene feels so natural, you would swear he had spent his entire life riding motorcycles. But the truth is that before filming Top Gun, Tom Cruise had actually never ridden one. To prepare for the role, Cruise had to learn from scratch. He went to a motorcycle shop in California called House of Motorcycles in El Cajon. His first practice sessions happened right there in the store's parking lot. Not a racetrack, not a professional training facility, just a young actor learning to balance between painted parking lines like any other beginner. It is hard to believe that was almost one of his very first times riding a motorcycle. And if you look at Tom Cruise today, the story becomes even funnier. Years later, he would literally ride motorcycles off mountains in action movies. That is what you call a real action hero. But the motorcycle was not the most dangerous moment Cruise faced while filming this movie. Another scene in Top Gun nearly turned into something much worse, something that even involved his life. Number 15. Tom Cruise nearly drowned while filming Top Gun. When people talk about dangerous moments in Top Gun, most of them immediately think about the F-14 jets racing across the sky. But ironically, one of the most dangerous moments for Tom Cruise actually happened underwater. While filming a rescue scene off the coast of Point Loma, California, Cruise had to jump into the ocean as part of the sequence. At first, everything went exactly as planned. But then, a small accident happened, the kind of accident that sounds terrifying once you hear the details. A parachute line from a camera rig became tangled in the watch Cruise was wearing. Within seconds, the line pulled him underwater. It held Cruise beneath the surface for about 40 seconds, long enough to send everyone on the set into panic. Fortunately, 2 U.S. Navy petty officers on location immediately jumped into the water and pulled him out. Their quick action saved Cruise from what could have been a very different ending for the film. Both men were later awarded Navy Commendation Medals for their fast response. Cruise survived and filming continued. You can breathe easy. But when you look back at the production of Top Gun, there is one chilling reality. Not everyone involved in making this movie was that lucky. Number 14. Stunt pilot Art Scholl was killed while filming Top Gun. When people talk about the behind-the-scenes story of Top Gun, there is one moment that always leaves the room silent. Art Scholl was not an actor appearing on screen. But if you have ever watched the realistic aerial maneuvers in the film, you were probably looking at his work. Scholl was a veteran Hollywood stunt pilot who had spent years flying and performing aerial stunts for movies. During Top Gun, he flew a Pitts S-2 aircraft equipped with cameras to capture flight shots and spinning aerial maneuvers. While performing a difficult maneuver called a flat spin, the aircraft failed to recover the way it was supposed to. Over the radio, Scholl reported a short message. "I have a problem. I have a real problem." Those were the final words recorded from the cockpit. The Pitts S-2 later crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft was never recovered, and Art Scholl never returned. He was 54 years old. When Top Gun premiered, the film ended with a dedication. This film is dedicated to the memory of Art Scholl. That was the crew's way of honoring the pilot who helped create the film's authentic flight scenes. If you love the aerial moments in Top Gun, take a moment to remember Art Scholl. If you would like, leave a small tribute for him in the comments below. Number 13. The MiG-28. In Top Gun does not actually exist. Has anyone watching this video ever been fascinated by the MiG-28 in Top Gun? That is the aircraft that appears in the final dogfights of the film, painted black and looking very different from Maverick's F-14. In the memory of many viewers, the MiG-28 feels like the most memorable enemy aircraft in the movie. But the MiG-28 is not actually a real aircraft. The plane you see on screen is actually the Northrop F-5E/F Tiger II, a fighter jet produced in the United States. In other words, in many scenes of Top Gun, the aircraft playing the enemy is actually an American jet. Sometimes filmmaking does not need to invent something completely new. All it takes is a different coat of paint. Number 12. Tom Cruise was reportedly born for this role, except for the height. If you look back at Top Gun, a lot of people will tell you Tom Cruise was practically born to play Maverick. From the way he walks in that leather flight jacket and aviators, to the confidence that practically comes off the screen, everything fits the character in a strangely perfect way. Honestly, it is hard to imagine anyone else replacing him in that role. There was just one small detail that gave the filmmakers a little pause. Height. Tom Cruise is about 5'7", while Kelly McGillis, who played Charlie, is about 5'10". When the two of them stand next to each other, that difference is pretty easy to notice on screen. So the production had to use a few familiar Hollywood tricks. Cruise often wore boots with lifts, while McGillis in some scenes had to go barefoot, so the height gap would not look quite so obvious. But the most interesting detail shows up in a late scene at the bar with the jukebox. The crew actually dug a small trench into the floor so Kelly McGillis could stand slightly lower, helping the two of them look about the same height when the camera hit the right angle. Number 11. Tony Scott wrote a $25,000 USD check just to capture a few more minutes of sunset. Tony Scott was the kind of director who had a very clear image in his head, and once he saw it, he almost never accepted a lesser version. While filming Top Gun on the aircraft carrier, Scott was waiting for the exact moment when the sun dropped behind the deck. He wanted planes taking off and landing with the sun as a backlight, creating that rich golden glow behind the aircraft. If you have ever watched those scenes in the film, you already know why he was so determined. It makes the movie look almost like a rock music video from the 1980s. But then a problem came up. The ship changed course. And with that one small change, the sun was no longer in the right position. When Scott asked whether the ship could turn back, he was told it would cost about $25,000. All of that just to shoot a few more minutes while the light still looked good. Tony Scott pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check for $25,000 on the spot so the ship would turn back into the right position, just to save a few minutes of sunset. You have just made it through the first half of the list. And trust me, The stories behind this movie only get more interesting from here. If you are still watching at this point, hit like and subscribe, because this list really starts accelerating now. Number 10. The Navy basically wrote the Top Gun script. Whenever people bring up Top Gun, there is almost always somebody who says the same familiar line, something like, "Oh, that movie was really just a Navy recruiting commercial." Some people go even further and say the US Navy basically wrote the script for Hollywood. Honestly, I have heard that story many times. But according to Jack Epps Jr., one of the film's screenwriters, the Pentagon and the Department of Defense were mostly pretty hands-off during the writing process. They were not sitting there deciding every scene or every line of dialogue. The filmmakers did ask for production support from the US Navy. And when you want to shoot on a real aircraft carrier with real planes and real pilots, there are obviously going to be a few conditions attached. Some fairly major changes came out of that. The title was changed from Top Guns to Top Gun. The character Charlie was changed from a Navy officer into a civilian contractor. The North Korean opponents in the early script were removed and turned into an unnamed enemy. And the cause of Goose's death was changed from a mid-air collision to an accident caused by jet wash during ejection. So saying the Navy wrote the Top Gun script is not completely accurate, but saying they had no influence on the movie at all is not exactly true either. Now you know. The truth sits somewhere mixed in between those two stories. Number 9. Anthony Edwards was the only actor who did not throw up in a fighter jet. Out of the entire cast of Top Gun, there was only one person who did not throw up while flying in a real fighter jet. That was Anthony Edwards, who played Goose. During filming, many of the flight scenes were done in real US Navy aircraft. The actors were put into the back cockpit, where they had to endure the same hard turns and G-forces real pilots experience. It sounds incredibly cool, but the human body does not always cooperate when you start throwing it through sharp spins and sudden acceleration like that. The result was that quite a few actors on the production had a very human reaction once the planes started maneuvering. They threw up. Anthony Edwards was the only one who managed to stay calm, or more accurately managed to keep his stomach completely under control through those flights. So if you ever thought becoming a fighter pilot looked impressive, it may be worth remembering one small extra detail. At the very least, try not to throw up. Number 8. The Navy only allowed 2 real missile launches to be filmed. If you watch the dogfights in Top Gun closely, there is a pretty interesting detail. In a few of the missile launch scenes, the aircraft seems to be flying very steadily, almost holding the same direction and altitude before the missile leaves the wing. In a real dogfight, that almost never happens. Pilots are usually maneuvering, constantly changing direction and altitude all the time. The reason for that stability is actually pretty simple. The US Navy only allowed the production to fire real missiles exactly 2 times during the entire shoot. Just 2 times. So the filmmakers shot those 2 launches from as many angles as possible, then reused those shots in multiple different dogfight scenes. Most of the missile launches you see in the movie were actually done with miniatures. Both the planes and the missiles were scale models, filmed very carefully to look real. And the funny part is that the miniatures were done so well, they even caught the Navy's attention. According to some behind-the-scenes stories, the effects looked so convincing that the Navy reportedly carried out a preliminary check just to make sure the production had not secretly staged more real missile launches beyond the 2 that had been approved. Number 7. Take My Breath Away was the song that softened all of Top Gun. Take My Breath Away. Just hearing the first few notes instantly takes me back to the movie, and I am guessing a lot of us feel the same way. The interesting part is that this song almost did not become tied to Top Gun the way we know it today. It was written by Giorgio Moroder and Tom Whitlock, and it was originally offered to the band The Motels, but they turned it down. The song eventually went to the band Berlin, and it was Terry Nunn's voice that convinced the songwriters they had finally found the right performer. Once the song was released, it quickly became the biggest hit of Berlin's career, and it later won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Number 6. Top Gun brought the leather flight jacket back. After Top Gun hit theaters, something pretty interesting happened that had nothing directly to do with planes or dogfights. People started dressing like Maverick. Leather flight jackets with military patches suddenly showed up everywhere. You could see them in clothing stores out on the street, even in photos of young people from that era. The movie did not just make audiences love F-14s. It turned the leather flight jacket into a style icon. According to stories repeated later on, the influence of the movie was strong enough that the US military even brought back the traditional leather flight jacket in some units. Not because of fashion, of course. But clearly that image came roaring back into the culture after the film was released. Sometimes a movie does not just make people want to become a pilot, it makes them want to dress like one. And now we have entered the final 5 facts on the list. If you are still here with me, let's count down the last 5 stories behind Top Gun. What is coming next is even more interesting. Number 5. Top Gun basically saved the Ray-Ban Aviator brand. If you look closely at Maverick in Top Gun, there is one item that almost never leaves him. Not the F-14 behind him, and not the motorcycle racing down the runway. It is the pair of Ray-Ban Aviators. The interesting part is that before the movie came out in 1986, Ray-Ban's Aviator line was no longer at its absolute peak. It had once been hugely popular with pilots and the military, but in mainstream fashion, its appeal had started to fade. Then, Top Gun arrived. Tom Cruise stepped onto the screen in a leather flight jacket with that confident smile and those aviators on his face. That image instantly became one of the symbols of the 1980s. According to many stories repeated in the industry, sales of Ray-Ban Aviators jumped by around 40% in the months after the film's release, a number big enough to make the entire fashion world pay attention. Number 4. Some of the romance scenes in Top Gun were added 5 months after the movie was already finished. There is a pretty interesting behind-the-scenes secret in Top Gun that a lot of people miss. Some of the film's most famous romantic scenes were not actually part of the original shooting plan. After the movie was completed, the filmmakers held test screenings for audiences, and the response they got was pretty clear. Viewers felt the relationship between Maverick and Charlie still was not fully clear. In other words, the romantic side of the movie was still a little thin. So the producers decided to do something fairly unusual. They brought Tom Cruise and Kelly McGillis back to shoot a few new scenes, even though the movie was basically finished by that point. The 2 scenes added later were the elevator scene and the bedroom love scene. What makes it interesting is that they were filmed about 5 months after the rest of the movie had already been completed. That gap was long enough to create a few visible little details on screen. When Kelly McGillis came back, she had lost about 16 pounds and her hair was darker, so in the elevator scene, she had to wear a hat to help hide the difference. Meanwhile, Tom Cruise was in the middle of filming The Color of Money, so his hair was longer than it had been in the earlier scenes. It is one of those little Hollywood secrets. Sometimes the romantic scenes audiences remember most are the ones added very late, long after the movie seemed finished. Number 3. Val Kilmer tried to sabotage his audition and still became Iceman. If you remember Top Gun, then you definitely remember Iceman. Val Kilmer's character is always there with that cool, confident presence, and he almost always seems ready to get under Maverick's skin. Honestly, it is hard to imagine this movie without the rivalry between those two. But the funny part is this: Val Kilmer did not want the role at all at first. According to a lot of behind-the-scenes stories, Kilmer did not really like the script in the beginning. He thought the story was pretty silly and far too openly pro-military. He even came up with an idea. If his audition looked bad enough, maybe they would not cast him. So he showed up in fairly strange clothes, read the lines in a very half-hearted way, and almost seemed like he was not trying to impress anyone in the room. But Hollywood sometimes works in very strange ways. The filmmakers still cast Val Kilmer as Iceman, and in the end, the man who tried to sabotage his own audition became one of the most memorable characters in Top Gun. Number 2. Top Gun got slammed by critics, and still became the biggest box office hit of the year. As soon as Top Gun hit theaters on May 16, 1986, something pretty unusual happened. Audiences went crazy for it. Critics stayed pretty cold. While a lot of critics were still debating whether the movie really had any depth, audiences did something much simpler. They went to the theater in droves. And the result was that Top Gun quickly climbed to the top spot as the highest-grossing domestic film of 1986 in North America. Its initial release brought in about $176.78 million, and when you add in later re-releases, the movie's total worldwide gross reached around $357 million. That was an enormous number at the time. But if you go back and read the reviews from when the movie first opened, the picture looks pretty different. Roger Ebert thought the romantic side of the film was pretty weak, even though he still admitted the aerial combat scenes were exciting. The New York Times said that once the planes landed, the movie seemed to lose its energy right along with them. And the Washington Post even compared Top Gun to a 110-minute recruiting commercial. What is interesting is that this feeling of controversial but still iconic has lasted all the way to today. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film sits at around 59% with critics, while audiences rate it at 83%. And that very contradiction leads to the biggest question in this whole story. If Top Gun was not just a box office hit, but also became such a massive cultural phenomenon, then what exactly was really behind its success? Number 1. Top Gun was suspected of being a military ad disguised as a Hollywood blockbuster. After all the behind-the-scenes stories surrounding Top Gun, there is one big question that has followed this movie for nearly 40 years. Was this simply a very exciting action movie? Or was it an incredibly effective advertisement for the US Navy? That question was not invented years later. It came up the moment the movie hit theaters. To make Top Gun, the production received major support from the US Navy. They were allowed to shoot on real aircraft carriers, use real fighter jets, and work with real pilots. Those things created a level of authenticity that very few movies of that era could match. Those adjustments led some critics at the time to make a pretty blunt observation. They called Top Gun a 110-minute recruiting ad. But the interesting part is that the debate did not weaken the movie at all. It was both an enormously entertaining Hollywood film and an idealized image of fighter pilots. And sometimes those two things blend together so perfectly that people stop separating them at all. I thought I was just retelling a few behind-the-scenes stories about Top Gun. But the more I looked into it, the more I shared, the more I remembered each scene from the movie. The more I wanted to go back and watch it again from the beginning. Maybe that is why I love making videos like this. Not just to tell behind-the-scenes secrets, but to remember together the movies we almost know by heart. If you love Top Gun 2, tell me in the comments which fact surprised you the most. And right now, I think I am going to go watch this movie one more time. And I will see you again in the next videos, when we keep digging into the fascinating secrets behind the classic movies the whole world has seen, but still does not know every story behind them.